Hello, everyone. You hear me? Okay. So today, as we agreed last time, today will be to answer the mock exam. I have prepared a set of 6 questions, and maybe you will get them all in the final, or at least you'll get 5 questions among the ones that we'll be discussing today. So, if we start with the first question, in the graph, the initial aggregate supply curve is AS0, and the initial aggregate demand curve is AD0. Some events that could have changed aggregate demand from AD0 to AD1 are, and we have 5 possibilities. First of all, in order to answer this question, we need first to find the initial equilibrium. So the initial equilibrium is held at point B. Here we are here, initially we are here. And then the question says some events that could have changed aggregate demand from ADU0 to AD1. So it's clear that we are talking about this movement, this shift from AD0 to AD1. And here I would like to ask, do you think that when the shift from AD0 to AD1 corresponds to an increase in aggregate demand or corresponds to a decrease in aggregate demand? What do you think? Yes, obviously it's an increase in aggregate. If the shift is to the left, it will be a decrease. Now, what are the events that could have caused aggregate demand to shift to the right? Or what are the events that could have caused an increase in aggregate demand? Is it an increase in expected future inflation? What do you think? When expected future inflation increases, will aggregate demand increases also? What happens when somebody expects that prices will increase in the future? What will happen to this individual? What will you do? Ask yourself this question. If you expect that tomorrow the price of your favorite phone will increase, and you have planned to buy this phone, what will you do today? You can check from your slides that when expected future inflation increases, people generally respond by increasing their present consumption, their present expenditure. So aggregate expenditure increases when expected future inflation increases. But what's about the rise in the exchange rate? What happens when the exchange rate rises? What's the meaning? What does it mean? The rise in exchange rate. Also here you have the details in your slides. So a rise in the exchange rate corresponds to an appreciation of the national currency or to a depreciation of national currency. What do you think? A rise. Hmm? So a rise in the exchange rate is equivalent to an increase, an appreciation of national currency. And from an aggregate perspective, when the exchange rate rises, exports become more expensive and imports become less expensive. So exports will increase and imports will, so exports will decrease and imports will increase. So if exports decrease and imports increase, do you think that aggregate demand increases or decreases as a result? Remember that aggregate demand, is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So if the exchange rate rises, exports fall and imports rise. What will be the consequence for aggregate demand? There will be an increase or a decrease? Why you are not participating? If you are not yet prepared, I can prepare just a recording. Okay, so I will proceed. I will answer the mock exam without asking for your participation. So the first option is wrong because the rise in the exchange rate causes a decrease in aggregate demand, while here we have an increase. Option B, the event is a rise in the exchange rate, so it's wrong. We agree that a rise in the exchange rate results in a decrease in aggregate demand, so option B is wrong. Option C is wrong. Option D, a decrease in the money wage or an increase in potential GDP. So here, there is no relationship between money wage rate and aggregate demand. The money wage rate changes can only have consequences on aggregate supply, not on aggregate demand. Also for potential GDP. So option D is wrong. Option E, an increase in expected future inflation, which is correct, and a decrease in taxation. And here is the right answer. So when taxation decreases, people increase their consumption expenditure, and so aggregate demand increases. So the right option is E. Second part of the question, following the change in aggregate demand, the new equilibrium is at point C or point B or point D. So when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, the new equilibrium will be the point of intersection of the new aggregate demand curve AD1 and the aggregate supply curve, the initial aggregate supply curve, which remains unchanged. So the new equilibrium is point C. So this is the first part, so it's point C. That means this is wrong and this is wrong. Now, is it a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap? If potential GDP is 1 trillion, if potential GDP is 1 trillion, that means if potential GDP is 1 trillion, this is potential GDP. So if potential GDP is $1 trillion, the economy has. So remember that the new equilibrium is here. So it's to the right of the vertical line, potential GDP. So at point C, real GDP is equal to 1.1, while potential GDP is equal to 1 trillion. So it's clear that we have an inflationary gap. If it was to the left of the vertical line, we have, if it's to the left of the vertical line, it will be a recessionary gap. But here it's to the right. If real GDP is higher than potential GDP, so we have an inflationary gap. So this is the right answer. This is for first question. Let's move to the second question. In an economy with no exports and imports, autonomous consumption is $2 trillion. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.6. Investment is $6 trillion. And government expenditure on goods and services is $4 trillion. Taxes are $3 trillion and do not vary with real GDP. Question: if real GDP is $20.4 trillion, calculate disposable income, consumption expenditure, and aggregate planned expenditure. What is equilibrium expenditure? So let's start with disposable income. Yes, exactly, Sabih. So disposable income is equal income minus taxes. So it's equal to 20.4 trillion minus 3 trillion taxation is equal to $17.4 trillion. This is disposable income. Let's move now to consumption expenditure. Consumption expenditure. Consumption expenditure is equal to autonomous expenditure plus induced or expenditure. So we consider that consumption expenditure, C, is equal to an autonomous part, C0, which doesn't depend on income, plus sorry, a second part that is induced that depends on GDP. So here in the data, we have this autonomous consumption, which is equal to 2. And we have very important information, the marginal propensity to consume. So this is the marginal propensity to consume. And in this example, the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.6. In other words, 60% of national income goes to consumption of goods and services. 60%. This is the interpretation of MPC, marginal propensity to consume. And in other words, also 40% of national income goes to saving. So if we apply this formula, so consumption expenditure is equal to 2 trillion plus 0.6 times disposable income. So it's equal to consumption expenditure C is equal to 2 trillion plus 0.6 times 17.4. It's equal to 12.4. I want to check something here. Can you check, please, from your slides, whether consumption expenditure depends on real GDP or on disposable income? you can go to the chapter expenditure multiplier. Can you check, please? It's very important. Otherwise, you'll get zero if you don't be careful about this particular information. So remember that this is the consumption function. Consumption has two parts, consumption expenditure, an autonomous part, C0, and an induced part. But in the induced part, we don't have real GDP, we have disposable income. Consumption depends on disposable income, not on real GDP. Okay, let's move to the third question. What is the aggregate planned expenditure? Aggregate planned expenditure. Yes. So aggregate planned expenditure, Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus inputs. But here it is said that with no exports and no imports. So we don't need these, we don't need exports and imports to figure in the general expression of aggregate planned expenditure. So the aggregate planned expenditure is equal to C is consumption, so Y is equal to consumption. How much we define consumption expenditure? $12.4, so it's equal to 12.4 plus, this is consumption, plus investment. How much investment? Plus 6, plus public expenditure on goods and services, 4. It's equal to $22.4 trillion. Now we come to the equilibrium expenditure, the last part, which is more difficult here. What is equilibrium expenditure? So equilibrium expenditure is the level of aggregate planned expenditure that equalizes real GDP. So here, when we calculated the aggregate planned expenditure, we find that it's equal to $22.4 trillion. However, real GDP is equal to $20.4 trillion. So we don't have equality between the two. So it's not an equilibrium expenditure. It's not an equilibrium expenditure. So the equilibrium expenditure, Y, sorry. So Y is equal to C plus I plus G. It's equal to 2 trillion plus 0.6 Y plus, this is consumption, plus investment is autonomous, so plus 6, plus public expenditure, which is also autonomous, is equal to 4. So it's equal to 8, so it's equal to 12 plus 0.6 Y. So we have here Y is equal 12 plus 0.6 Y. In other words, Y minus 0.6 Y is equal to 12. In other words, 0.4 Y is equal to 12. In other words, Y is equal to 12 divided by 0.4. Is equal to 30. So the equilibrium expenditure Y star is equal to 30. This is how to answer this question. So equilibrium expenditure consists, finding equilibrium expenditure consists in finding the value of Y that equalizes, this is real GDP, and this is aggregate demand. We need to find the equality in order to get what we have represented in our course. This is the 45 degrees line, and this is the aggregate expenditure line. In other words, we are looking for this point, which is equal to 30 in our example. This is regarding second equation, the second question. Let's move to the third question. The table gives the elements of planned expenditure. So we have a table in which real GDP can take two values, 0 or 1 trillion. So the question, when real GDP is 1 trillion, we are talking about this part. When real GDP is equal to 1 trillion, what are aggregate planned expenditure, autonomous expenditure, and induced expenditure? So the answer is easy. So aggregate expenditure, aggregate planned expenditure is equal, as usual, C plus I, investment, plus G, public expenditure, plus exports minus imports. So it's equal to 2.1 plus 0.5 plus 0.2 plus 0.8 minus 0.5. It's equal to 2.6, 2.8, 3.6, $3.1 trillion. Now, what is autonomous expenditure? This is a difficult question for those who don't know the significance of autonomous expenditure. Remember that autonomous expenditure is the part of aggregate expenditure that doesn't depend on real GDP. Autonomous expenditure is remember that autonomous expenditure is equal to C0, the autonomous consumption, plus investment, plus public spending, plus M0. M0. The part of imports that doesn't depend on real GDP. Now, how to find autonomous consumption, for example? So we need to look at this column. When real GDP is equal to 0, consumption expenditure is equal to 0.5. This is C0. 0.5 is C0. When real GDP is equal to 0, investment is equal to 0.5, but here also it's equal to 0.5. That means investment is always autonomous. When real GDP is equal to 0, also government expenditure is equal to 0.2. It is also equal to 0.2 when it's equal to 1. That means government expenditure is autonomous expenditure. Exports depend on are exogenous. That means doesn't depend on real GDP. Even when real GDP is 0, exports is 0.8 trillion. And imports here, when real GDP is 0, imports are 0. That means we don't have autonomous imports. So autonomous expenditure is equal to 0.5 plus 0.5 plus 0.2 plus 0.8. It's equal to 1, 2 is equal to $2 trillion. What is induced expenditure now? Induced expenditure is the part of expenditure that is related to real GDP. So here, if we agree that aggregate expenditure is equal to autonomous expenditure plus induced expenditure, and we already know that aggregate expenditure is equal to 3.1, and that autonomous expenditure is equal to 2, so it's obvious that induced expenditure is equal to aggregate expenditure minus autonomous expenditure. It's equal to 3.1 minus 2. It's equal to 1.1 trillion. This is how to solve this exercise. Let's move to another exercise. An economy has no imports and no income taxes. MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, is 0.8, and real GDP is $200 billion. Businesses increase investment by $10 billion. Calculate the multiplier and the change in real GDP. Now, here you need to know what is the multiplier. So the multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. This is the multiplier. So here MPC is equal to 0.8. So the multiplier is equal, of course, here we have no imports. We have no imports and we have no taxation. Otherwise, the multiplier would have been different. The multiplier will be equal to 1 divided by 1 minus MPC plus the marginal propensity to import plus the taxation multiplier, the taxation coefficient. But here we don't have income taxation, we don't have imports, so we have the basic form of the multiplier. So here the multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus 0.8 is equal to 1 divided by 0.2 is equal to 5. The multiplier is equal to 5. Calculate the change in real GDP. So the change in real GDP the change in Y is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, or it's equal to the multiplier times the change in here businesses increase investment. That means the change in investment. So if investment is equal to plus 10 billion, then, and we know that we know that the multiplier is equal to 5. So the change in real GDP is equal to 5 times 10 is equal, it's equal to $50 billion. $50 billion. So the new GDP, if we have the value, so if real GDP is equal to $200 billion, the new GDP will be equal to $250 billion. But here the question is only about the change in real GDP. So the change in real GDP here is equal to $50 billion. Let's move to another exercise. The table describes 5 possible outcomes for 2017, depending on the level of aggregate demand in that year. Potential GDP is $8 trillion, and the natural unemployment rate is 4%. Using the Ocon law, when the employment rate is 4%, what is real GDP? And here, in order to answer the question, you need first to know what is the Ocon law. Ocon law. So you can check from your slides the chapter about the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, the policy trade-off, the last chapter. So according to the Ocon law, so if the unemployment rate, is one point above the natural unemployment rate, then real GDP will be 2 points below potential GDP. Okay, this is the Ocon law. So here, when the unemployment rate is 4%, and we have the information that the natural unemployment rate is 4%. So here, the real or the unemployment rate, the prevailing unemployment rate, is equal to the natural unemployment rate. So as a consequence, there is no deviation between real GDP and potential GDP. So if natural unemployment, if the unemployment rate is equal to the natural unemployment rate, real GDP is equal to potential GDP. So here, potential GDP is equal to $8 trillion. So real GDP will also be equal to 8 trillion. To 8 trillion. That's because the natural unemployment rate or the prevailing unemployment rate is equal to the natural unemployment rate. Let's move to the last question. The table describes 4 possible outcomes for 2017, depending on the level of aggregate demand in that year. Potential GDP is $8 trillion, and the natural unemployment rate is 6%. So we have the price level, and we have the unemployment rate. Draw the 4 points, A, B, C, and D, on the aggregate supply curve. So here you are not asked to draw the Phillips curve, you are asked to draw the aggregate supply curve. But in order to draw the aggregate supply curve, remember that the aggregate supply curve describes the relationship between real GDP and the price level. But we don't have the real GDP here. We only have the potential GDP. And the potential GDP is equal to 8 trillion. It's a vertical line. But we are requested to find the aggregate supply curve, starting from this information. So we will follow the last exercise, the last question. So we need the Oken law. In order to draw the aggregate supply curve, we need to find the real GDP, the different values for real GDP. How to find it? So remember the golden rule or the Oken rule. The Oken rule. So if the unemployment rate is 1 point higher than the natural unemployment rate, real GDP is 2 points lower or below the potential GDP. So at point A, for example, at point A, the unemployment rate is equal to 9%. And the natural unemployment rate is 6%. The natural unemployment rate is 6%. That means the unemployment rate is 3 points below or higher. The unemployment rate is 3 points higher than natural unemployment rate. As a consequence, real GDP is 6 points below potential GDP. So at point A, we have 2.5 here. So point A, so the unemployment rate is equal to 9 and the natural employment rate is equal to 6. That means the prevailing unemployment rate is 3 points higher than the natural unemployment rate. And as a consequence, real GDP will be 6 points below potential GDP. So potential GDP is equal to 8 trillion. So at point A, real GDP is equal to 8 trillion times 8 trillion at point A, real GDP will be equal to, so we said 6 points, 6 points, so it's equal to 8 trillion times 0.94, 6 points. So it's equal to 8 times 0.94, 7.752. This is at point A. At point B, the unemployment rate is equal to 6, which is equal to the natural unemployment rate, 6. So real GDP is equal to potential GDP. So at point B, real GDP is equal to 8. At point C, unemployment rate is equal to 4, while natural unemployment rate is equal to 6%, so it's lower. So here, if the unemployment rate is 1 point lower than natural unemployment rate, real GDP will be 2 points higher than potential GDP. So here, because so the prevailing unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate is 2 points, here at 0.4, is 2 points lower than natural unemployment rate, real GDP will be 4 points higher than potential GDP. So at point C, real GDP will be equal to 8 times 1 plus 0.4 is equal to 8 times 1.04 is equal to 8.32. Is equal to 8.32. Finally, at point D, unemployment rate is equal to 3%, which is 3 points below the natural unemployment rate. So real GDP at point D, real GDP will be equal, 6 points higher than 6 points higher than potential GDP. So at point D, real GDP is equal to 8 times 1 plus 0.6 is equal to 8.48. It's equal to 8.48. Now we have our different points. So point A, we have so point A 102.5 and 7.752. So 7.52 should be here, something here. And 102.5. So this is point A. But if, but remember here, sorry, it's very important information. So here you are asked to calculate values of real GDP to 1 decimal place. So here it becomes 7.5. Here it becomes here 8.5, and here is 8.3. So we need to take into consideration every time. All the instructions should be taken into consideration. Yes, Sabiha, point C, at point C, the unemployment rate is equal to 4. Okay, the unemployment rate is equal to 4. and the natural unemployment rate is equal to 6. So here the unemployment rate is 2 points, 2 points below the natural unemployment rate. So if the unemployment rate is 2 points below the natural unemployment rate, real GDP will be 4 points higher than the potential GDP. So here, that's why we multiply by 1.04, or sorry, here I made a mistake here. I made a mistake at point C. Real GDP is equal to 8 times 1 plus 0.04. And here is the same. It's not 0.6, but it's 0.06, 6%. So point D, GDP is equal to 8 times 1 plus 0.06. Yeah. So we found so 7.5. So here 7.5 plus 102.5. So this is point A. Point B, 8. So it's equal to 8. 8 plus 105. So it will be here. Point C, we have 8.3, and the price level is equal 107.5. So it's here, point C. And finally, point D, we have 8.5, this point, and 110. This is point D. So now we can, this is the aggregate supply curve. Okay, that's all. And maybe this is the most difficult exercise, but once we know which method to follow, it becomes very easy. So that's all for today. We have finished with the mock exam. If you have further questions, you can email me, or you can post your questions on MS Teams. I will be happy to answer all of your questions. Thank you very much, and good luck in the final. Thank you.